Right. Well, we know what to do. We can fight these Deadites. We can fight them with science. Now, what weapon do I take with me? What do I take with? I was only joking, baby. Of course I was gonna take you all along. Let's go give them some sugar, baby. Hi, Lester, Wushu Engineer. A while ago, I uploaded a series of videos comparing the striking performance of various weapons, in particular the Nunchaku and the flute, or stick. I'm going to refer to the stick as a flute or a stick interchangeably through this video because in my system, essentially stick fighting is practiced with a length of stick representing a flute. Now, the first of the videos that I made a while ago was actually in response to Shad of Shadiversity, who posted a video about the Nunchaku, in which he shared some of his thoughts on the stick as an inherently superior weapon. I would encourage you to watch these earlier videos, obviously Shad's original video and my earlier videos as well. Because my earlier videos provide more of a context for this video. For new viewers of my content, I should give a brief introduction of myself and who I represent before I carry on any further. So apologies for all of those regular viewers of mine who've heard this before, but I am a registered professional and chartered electrical engineer, as well as being the head of a martial arts school here in Australia. I am also a self-defense instructor, and I am the head engineer of Martel, which is the Martial Arts Research and Testing Laboratory. The Wushu scientist and I are actively engaged in researching human performance within the context of martial arts. In addition to her ongoing work at the University of Southern Queensland, the Wushu scientist is also currently busy working on her big PhD research project, which is aimed at studying the effects of a new training program that we have developed at Martel based on certain traditional internal martial arts training methods. Now, several representatives of the Australian Defence Force are actually eagerly awaiting the results of our research and are keen to incorporate our final training program in their training program. So that's quite interesting and exciting for us. If the study is successful, this training program that we've developed could significantly improve the health and physical performance of soldiers. As part of the Wushu scientists' study, Martel developed a very comprehensive and cutting-edge method to measure human striking characteristics. This method, which we call the impulse block method, allows us to measure the characteristics associated with a strike, including impulse or change in momentum, impact velocity, kinetic energy, power, and apparent mass. I'll go into a bit more detail on the method later in this video, but this method allows us to definitively assess the striking characteristics of any kind of bare hand strike, whether it's a kick or a punch or a headbutt or shoulder barge or what have you, whatever you like, along with any kind of blunt impact weapon strike, if the weapon is suitably padded. Cutting weapons are a little bit more difficult to assess, but never fear. Although progress is slow because of how much I have on my plate at the moment, a method is slowly being developed to extend the impulse block method to actually accommodate for edged weapons and enable us to create a method of measuring and comparing edged weapon performance. Because the impulse block method is an in-house method that was developed here in Martel, along with the associated modified equipment, to our knowledge, we are currently the only people with access to the means to allow this kind of comprehensive scientific testing of human striking. So using our equipment and methodology, we are uniquely positioned to answer questions about the characteristics of human martial performance. And that's precisely what we did. In my first Nunchaku versus stick videos, we did a number of comparisons between the flute and the stick and the Nunchaku. Swung using one-handed grip techniques, and found that there were actually differences between the performances of the two weapons. However, the differences were quite minor in most cases. I was actually genuinely surprised by how similar the results were. In fact, when you watch that video, you may even be able to pick up on my level of surprise, because I thought that the flute or stick was going to be the clear winner there. It's a much simpler weapon to use, it's much less specialized, much easier to connect with through biomechanics and the human kinetic chain at the instant of impact to manipulate the results of the strike. So I was really surprised to see such similar results. There's a certain humility that scientists need to cultivate when it comes to research and testing. Although we all formulate our own precious opinions and hypotheses about various things, theories can be overturned by results. And at least in some cases, we have to have the humility to acknowledge that perhaps we were wrong about something. However, sometimes unexpected results are generated not because your theory or hypothesis was incorrect, but because the tests were just not designed well enough to isolate the underlying principle that you were trying to research. In other words, perhaps other variables were being introduced into the tests, which skewed the results. An example of this may be wanting to show, for instance, that the acceleration due to gravity is a constant for objects of different masses. In a badly formulated test, one might choose a feather and a wooden ball as the objects of dissimilar mass, which would lead to results that are skewed because of an unknown and unaccounted for variable, which in that case would be air resistance. In the case of these earlier videos of mine examining the Nunchaku, the results are certainly valid and relevant. However, the tests were structured around one-handed strikes, which in this case perhaps did not showcase one of the potential differences between the two weapons. Incidentally, we also compared the performance of the Nunchaku and the flute or stick to the performance of the tonfa in one of the videos for all of those who are potentially interested in how a tonfa performs. Recently, Shad posted another video on his channel in which he hypothesized that if a two-handed grip technique were to be used with both weapons, that the results would be far more divergent and weighted in favor of the performance of a simple stick. The Wushu scientist and I thought that this was a reasonable research question or request, and so we offered to do the tests, redo the tests, using two-handed grip and striking techniques with both weapons. Shad responded to our offer and encouraged us to do the test. So here we are again, doing this thing. I must stress right here that I don't have a horse in this race. For some reason that I cannot actually personally identify with, people are incredibly precious about their own opinions. So there's a very heated debate that often erupts around whether one weapon is better than another. The Nunchaku versus the stick is one that's drawn a lot of controversy. Another one of these, let's say, holy cow weapons with a cult following is the katana. Even angels fear to tread into the midst of that apocalyptic nuclear wasteland That's all that's left of that stale old keyboard war. So I wanted to say that I'm not making this video to prove necessarily that any one weapon is better or worse than another. I will make certain observations in my discussion of the results. And I will say here that one weapon was clearly superior on almost every front in the context of the tests that I performed in this video. However, I, like Matt Easton, believe in the concept of context. I believe Matt Easton is often referred to as Captain Context. Every martial arts system, weapon, and technique has its own context within which it either did or does exist and function. In fact, I actually train with both the Nunchaku and the flute regularly, along with a whole bunch of other weapons and also various bare hand fighting styles and techniques. If you were to ask me the question, would the Nunchaku be the first weapon I pick up if there was trouble? Probably not, because it's illegal to carry them here in Queensland, but it does depend. Would the flute or stick be my go-to weapon of choice? Possibly, but it's unlikely I would have that with me when I needed it anyway. I'd have to answer some hard questions from the police if I choose to carry a big stick around with me. Do you see what I'm trying to say? We're really talking about hypothetical situations when we talk about which weapon is better, and the actual characteristics of the situation at hand in which they will be used is going to exert a very strong influence over what we choose to use or what is even available to us. Another example of that is I often get comments, or at least I have had comments from my American viewers on some of my videos, essentially saying, well, I wouldn't use that, I would just use a gun. Well, living in Australia, gun laws are quite restrictive, and I wouldn't be able to carry a gun around with me. So what's the point of saying, well, I'd use a gun? It's a completely hypothetical situation within the context of the environment in which I live. Now, although I will share my observations in this video, I don't expect you to necessarily agree with me, and I certainly won't tell you what to think about either weapon in this video. I like to think that my viewership are all intelligent and mature people who can make their own minds up, who can also hold differing views from other people while still respecting them, and formulate their own opinions based on the presented data. Some may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. So on to a discussion of the methodology. These are the two weapons that I used in the test, the Nunchaku and the flute. They're the same weapons I used in my previous tests. Both are constructed of the same Australian hardwood. In fact, they were both actually originally cut from the same pole. The weapon lengths were identical when first made, although the Nunchaku rope has stretched somewhat during repeated use and is now perhaps a couple of centimeters longer than the flute. The Nunchaku is 78 centimeters long, whereas the flute or the stick is 76 centimeters long. In addition, the flute is heavier because there's more wood present in the weapon. The Nunchaku weighs 607 grams, whereas the flute weighs 787 grams. These differences between the weapons will have to be considered test limitations for the purposes of these tests. During the tests, both weapons were wrapped in high-density EVA foam to protect the test equipment from damage. In terms of striking techniques used, the striking tests were performed with both weapons wielded in a two-handed grip and swung roughly horizontally to strike the measuring equipment. I tried to use similar biomechanics in both sets of tests to limit the variables. A total of 7 strikes were performed with both weapons and then analyzed. Now, this is a very, very small sample set. And In cases like this video, we have to keep the sample set quite small because actually there is an incredible amount of work involved in crunching the numbers afterwards. A job which I have to thank the Wushu scientist for doing. The tests that we performed in this video were performed using the impulse block equipment and method. So I should discuss in more detail the impulse block method, and my apologies if you've heard this before, but for those of you who are new to the channel, the impulse block method allows for one of the most comprehensive analyses of human striking available currently to our knowledge. As a matter of interest, our impulse block method is currently being independently tested for validity and reliability as part of a study by another researcher from the University of Southern Queensland. In a nutshell, the impulse block equipment consists of a specially designed foam spring called the impulse block attached to the front face of a load cell that records force input at a sampling rate of approximately 1 kilohertz, along with a laser photogate timer that allows the measurement of time of flight in microseconds across a 1 centimeter gap just prior to impact with the impulse block. So this allows us to measure the final velocity at the point of impact, or as close as we're going to get. Using the measured value from the force time data plot produced by the load cell along with the time of flight of the impacting object just prior to impact, it becomes possible to calculate a number of characteristics associated with the impacting object. These include impulse or change in momentum imparted by the strike, impact velocity, peak filtered impact force, predicted impact surface dependent impact force, kinetic energy of the impact, power of the impact, and apparent or effective mass behind the strike. Now I must explain, and please note that apparent or effective mass is not simply the mass of the weapon or the mass of the part of the body involved in the strike. It is calculated from the impulse value and is actually that part of the mass of the whole human subject / weapon system that is involved in the impact. I've seen some studies that haven't quite understood this concept and have, for instance, the worst one that I've seen involved calculation of kinetic energy of boxing or a boxer's strikes by literally measuring the weight of the boxer's arm and incorporating that into the kinetic energy equation. Now the only way that that would be correct would be if the boxer was literally to tear their own arm off at the shoulder and throw it at the measuring equipment. And then you could say, well, yes, it's more than likely just the mass of the arm involved in that strike. But when the arm is connected to the rest of the body becomes involved. So it's not as simple as just the weight of the arm, or in this case, the weight of the weapon, because as soon as I pick up this weapon is essentially part of my body. So it's a lot more complicated than some people understand. Now for a more detailed explanation of the impulse block equipment and method, you can see my other videos on the subject. I'm not going to get into much more detail than that here, aside from saying that in my previous videos involving the impulse block method, we have shown only half the total impulse value on our tables. Now this is because that is what is used to calculate other values such as kinetic energy, apparent mass, and power. As such, in this video, when we compare the results obtained in this set of tests, we will provide both the half impulse values and the full impulse values for easy comparison between the two. Now, no scientific test would be complete without mentioning the sources of error. Although it is not typically considered a source of error in sports science, my natural human performance variation far eclipses the scale of variation and error introduced by other sources. Relative to natural human performance variation, the scale of equipment measurement error is so small in this case that it can safely be ignored. I should mention that the equipment used in these tests has also been, the load cell has also been independently calibrated by the University of Southern Queensland. Lastly, we should also acknowledge that a very small sample size was used, only 7 tests for each weapon. This can lead to errors. However, in this case, statistical analysis by the Wushu scientist indicated that the data set was sufficient to achieve statistical significance for most variables, allowing us to draw solid conclusions from the data set even though it is quite small. And after that brief discussion of the methodology, this is what the tests looked like. So welcome to the testing part of the video. I'm going to start the tests with the flute, aka the stick. As you can see, I've got it very well padded. For all intents and purposes with this measuring equipment, the impulse block method and the equipment that we're using here, the padding doesn't actually matter because the device is not measuring impact force per unit area or impact pressure, if you like. All we're measuring is impact force. We're measuring impulse, measuring kinetic energy and power and other characteristics like that, which in this case are not really affected by the padding on the weapon. I'm trying to protect the equipment from any kind of damage. I'm also going to be wearing a face shield, as you can see, because, well, while I may not be the prettiest person in the world, I do have to look after my face sometimes. The Wushu scientist is going to be doing the measurements for the load cell, and I'm going to be resetting the timer, the microsecond timer, every time we do the test. Please excuse the glare from the side. Unfortunately, we have a large sliding door in that area, trying to keep it out of the shot as much as possible, but you will get some flare across the side of the screen there, so there's not much I can do about that. Anyway, let's begin with the tests. Now, before I begin, I might just explain the biomechanics I'm going to be using here. So I'm going to be adopting a lower stance, and this is with both weapons, to maximize my velocity, my acceleration, and I'm going to be impacting to the side like that. Okay? So simple biomechanics, but I'm going to try and maximize the impact with both weapons. In the case of the flute, obviously in both cases I'm going to be using a two-handed grip. With the flute, obviously a little bit easier to, or at least in my opinion at the moment, maybe a little bit easier to create that sustained force at the moment of impact. But I'm going to try and do the same with the Nunchaku as well. I'm going to, even though it's got a flexible linkage, there is a brief moment where I can actually pull on that flexible linkage at the moment of impact and create some kind of sustained force. So I'm going to give both weapons the best run for the money that I can give them and try and get the best outcome for both. Okay, let's begin.
Okay, so you need to
just switch on the timer, reset, check that it's working, reset.
and start on 0.
Just say when.
Okay, when you're ready. Okay,
So that was 476 microseconds.
4, 7, 6, and the peak here at the moment was 1163.
Okay.
Alright. Start 0. Okay. Alright.
Okay, so that was 504 microseconds.
504. And this was 1, 2, 4, 7.
Okay, let's say when.
Okay. Right.
490 microseconds.
So 490, and here is 1069. Okay, ready?
Okay, so that's 524 microseconds.
524, and this was 1085. Let's double check. It's going into the folder. Yep. Okay. Right.
So that's 583 microseconds.
583, and the peak force was 1114. So we've got 2 more strikes.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice.
499 microseconds.
499, and this was 1113. That's very consistent. Okay.
Last go.
Start. Okay. Right.
510.
Right. So 510, and here it was 1162. Okay. Good job.
Okay. So we'll proceed onto the Nunchaku. So on to the next testing section. I have the Nunchaku here. I've got one side padded, and I'm going to be wearing the face shield again. As I said for the previous during the previous weapon tests, I'm going to be using a similar biomechanics to try to maximize my impact, and we'll see what happens. Okay, check, that's working.
Okay, when you're ready. Yeah.
So that's 477 microseconds.
477. And the peak force was 960.
Okay, check when you're ready.
Okay.
467.
467, and the peak force was 858.
Certainly appears to be faster, at least from the first 2 tests.
Yeah. Just a second. Okay. Good. Alright.
469.
469 and 890. And the peak force is lower. Okay. Start. 0. Okay.
453.
453.
Yeah,
37.
the impact velocity definitely seems to be faster.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Interesting. Okay.
Working.
Okay, number 5.
470.
903, so 470, 903. Okay.
That was a bit slower. 540.
540 and 950. Right.
475.
Okay. 475, and this was 846. So quite clear differences in both there, I think.
Okay. Do I have one more test?
That was it.
That was
7.
Okay.
Did
Well, that was really quite interesting. As we're clearly commenting while we're busy doing the tests, there are already clear differences in the data. It appears as though the Nunchaku are moving much faster, or at least, let's say, significantly faster. The impact, unfiltered impact peak, the peak force seems to be lower. So it seems to corroborate some of the testing that we've done previously, but in this case I think perhaps the difference between the two is going to be more significant. We'll have to run the numbers. I'm excited to see what the results are going to be. As I mentioned earlier in my video, I don't have a horse in this race. I like both weapons. I like pretty much all weapons, and I train with both, so I'm quite interested to see what's going to come out of this. After the tests were completed, the Wushu scientist went on to crunch the relevant numbers and perform data analysis for us, along with statistical analysis. And I have to say thank you, Wushu scientist, you saint you. As part of her data analysis and statistical analysis, she also included the calculation of mean and standard deviations. If you, like me, run screaming at the mention of statistical analysis, this may not seem particularly relevant to you. However, statistical analysis is an incredibly useful tool that allows data sets to be analyzed for relevance. No scientific paper reporting data is considered reliable if adequate statistical analysis is not conducted. And for instance, in the case of the Wushu scientist's current PhD study, an independent statistical analyst is going to be engaged to do independent statistical analysis of the results to ensure that no bias is introduced into the study. So it's very serious. It's taken very seriously in scientific circles and in scientific papers. So in terms of the statistical analysis, paired t-tests were performed to compare the results and determine significance. When I show the data, just remember that a p-value of less than 0.05 indicates statistical significance. So on to the results. I'm going to start by first providing a table of results from my last video comparing the Nunchaku, the flute, and the tonfa. Although in this table the tonfa's results are not shown because they're not relevant to the video. Please note that in all the following tables the values are presented as a mean or average plus or minus standard deviation. In addition, results that are statistically significant in terms of the difference between them are shown in bold with an asterisk alongside. As mentioned earlier, The results obtained in this set of tests were very similar. Only two measures were statistically significant in terms of the differences between them, and those were impulse and kinetic energy. The flute or stick's impulse was 6% higher with a p-score of 0.02, and the flute or stick's kinetic energy was 11% higher with a p-score of, again, 0.02. Now I'll show the table results from the set of tests performed in this video. This time around, there were very clear differences between the weapon performances. 6 of the 8 striking characteristics of the flute or stick tested in this set of tests were statistically significant and superior to those of the Nunchaku. Power was not statistically significant in terms of the difference between the two weapons. I might also add here that if we use the old imperial definition of horsepower, or a conversion from watts to horsepower, it's quite interesting to note that even though we're talking about energy transfer over such a short duration of time, the power represented in these strikes is approximately 10 horsepower, which is quite interesting, even though it's obviously a very short duration. So the energy is transferred over a very short impact duration. What I might add is velocity was extremely close to being statistically significant in favor of the Nunchaku. We performed 7 strikes for each, as I mentioned, and we did not remove outliers from any of these strikes. The Nunchaku's strikes were 6.5% faster than the flute strikes, with a p-value of 0.051. So we can easily and confidently say that this is approaching statistical significance. In addition, if we removed the 2 lowest values from each set of results, both for the Nunchaku and the flute, each of which were outliers, so each of those lowest results could be considered outliers, the p-value was 0.02, which signifies statistical significance. So we can say with a high level of confidence that the Nunchaku struck with higher impact velocity than the flute or stick. However, for all the rest of the characteristics, the flute or stick outperformed the Nunchaku. Before sharing some of my conclusions and observations based on this data, I'll present tables comparing the one- and two-handed performance of each weapon individually. So firstly, the flute. From these results, it can be seen that striking two-handed with the flute resulted in between 49 to 60% increases in kinetic energy, apparent mass, impulse, and impact duration. So transitioning from a one to a two-handed grip, whether it's two-handed grip there, in this case, in these tests, it was a two-handed swing like this, significantly increases most of its striking characteristics, as you would intuitively think. This could be seen This could be seen as a convenient rule of thumb regarding two-handed use of a flute or a stick held like a baseball bat. Wielding the flute or stick two-handed essentially increases most of its impact characteristics by 50%. There was also an 18% increase in numerically filtered peak force, but there was no significant change in velocity, which is interesting, and no significant change in power. Now here is a comparison between one- and two-handed use of the Nunchaku. The Nunchaku was much less affected by transitioning from a one to a two-handed usage than the flute or stick. There was a 33% increase in impact duration, a 31% increase in kinetic energy, a 15% increase in impulse, a 14% increase in velocity, and no change in apparent mass or power. So if we compare how one- and two-handed grips affect the performance of each weapon, we can see that increases occurred in both weapons in terms of kinetic energy, impulse, and impact duration. However, the relative increases were far higher in the flute. An increase in apparent mass was only seen in the flute, and that was a 50% increase. No change in apparent mass was seen in the Nunchaku. The two-handed strikes did not increase apparent mass. So clearly, I was really struggling to create that kind of connection through the flexible linkage and increase that apparent mass. An increase in velocity was only seen in the Nunchaku, which was a 14% increase. And that's interesting, that the Nunchaku was actually moving faster with a two-handed strike. No change in velocity was seen in the flute. So we could say that it is potentially easier to increase the Nunchaku's impact velocity using a two-handed grip than that of the flute. So very clearly we have a winner in this set of tests, this particular set of tests within the context of these tests. However, I would like to add that the results potentially appear to shed a bit of interesting light on how the Nunchaku are actually designed to be used. I believe that it is a safe observation to make that the Nunchaku are designed primarily as a one-handed weapon, and the results seem to confirm this. Although both hands are involved in their use, often changing grips or moving from one hand to the other, or potentially wrapping around or blocking weapons, catching weapons in the rope section, most Nunchaku strikes are performed with a single hand grip. Whereas in flute forms or stick forms, in particular in a flute form like my own, various two-handed grips are often used for striking. The results support this because the Nunchaku's performance was far less affected by transitioning from a one-handed to a two-handed grip. In other words, there wasn't much benefit in using two hands with the Nunchaku. So it could be said that it is best to use them only in one hand. I could say that the flute or stick is not as specialized a weapon as the Nunchaku. It can be used in either one or two hands with significant changes to the way that the weapon performs based on the grip. A stick is also something that can be picked up and used intuitively by most people. Perhaps not well, but maybe well enough. I've seen some commenters saying that they felt that the Nunchaku were originally intended for more lightly built wielders. It's possible that that notion is supported by these results. The Nunchaku have a higher impact velocity and similar power to that measured for the flute within a similar ballpark. As such, given sufficient training, they could be seen as perhaps more nimble, maybe, able to deliver their energy payload over a much shorter impact duration, perhaps good for darting in and out with rapid striking, more of a yin weapon if you like, perhaps not good for smashing through defenses or for manipulating opponents with sustained force, impulse and apparent mass behind strikes. Subjectively, I can feel that less energy is required to rapidly accelerate the Nunchaku or change its trajectory than is required for the stick. And actually this notion is something that we at Martel actually have the equipment to test at some stage. Perhaps someday we may do an investigation involving EMG analysis of muscle engagement, perhaps in the arm, the forearm, during strikes. But that would be a lot of work, maybe sometime in the future. Well, I'd like to thank you all for remaining with me for this long. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all again next time. And thank you for the mention, Shad. Cheers.